welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or somebody you know would like to come on the show and chat with me, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. My handle there is IsaacR11, or you can reach out to me on Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11 at fossilnon.org. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm running out of coffee, so we should probably get to the conversation. I'm looking forward to it. We were talking a lot about, the Olympics that are going on right now in Paris, and he just happens to live in the area. So we're going to maybe talk a little bit about that, talk about some tech as well. So my guest today is David Ebbo. David, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Isaac, for the intro. So yes, I'm David Ebbo. Used to live in Washington. Last year I've been living in Paris. And I guess I'm here to talk about technology and maybe sports and whatever else. So.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to the conversation because, for folks that that might not know, like a lot of the tools that you probably use or the technologies that you've used, David was a part of some of these tools and some of these things. So, hopefully we'll be able to get some, insider information or maybe some great anecdotes around some of these technologies and some of the trends that have been built around them. But I'd love to start out all of my conversations with tech origin stories. So, my question for you is, when did you realize that technology was the thing that you were interested in? A lot of people sometimes they had computers early in the home. Maybe some people they were introduced to technology a little bit later. Like, when did technology introduce itself to you?
It's an interesting question. I'm old enough to have had a childhood where I really didn't have computers because we didn't have them back in the 70s, or they were, so they were not common, certainly. So to me, it's like I always felt that there was this thing I wanted to do, but I couldn't. I mean, of course, I like things like calculators, but really the first exposure that I've had to actual computers, I don't know how that was, maybe 9 or 10. And my mom took me to a place in Paris where they had computers that were running a language called Logo. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Mm-hmm. It's basically a pretty simple language where you have something they call the turtle, and you would just move the turtle around. You would say, like, move forward by such distance, rotate to the right, rotate to the left. And you could essentially do programming that way. And to me, that was like eye-opening. That was really my first exposure to anything that resembles a programming language. And after that, I was hooked, even though I still really didn't have any equipment at home. I think, at that point, I was really looking for opportunities to be near computers or do things. I think probably my next opportunity was some summer camp where my parents sent me, where they had those really basic computers called the ZX80s. Okay. If you see what that is, they had like really crappy keyboard. There was just this flat piece of plastic that had you'd program in BASIC, and each key was actually a basic instruction. But it was a lot of fun. So that was really my first exposure to BASIC. And I kind of went on from there. And eventually my parents were nice enough to buy an Apple IIe that we had at home. And I think that's when I really kind of got started having my own, that got sort of took over my life at that point.
No, that's pretty fascinating. Like, you say take over your life, right? What does that mean?
Yes.
Does that just mean being like constantly fascinated with it? Because I think one thing that I've seen over and over and over again with people in tech is they're curious by nature, and especially when it comes to like how things work with electronics and technology, right? Were you also kind of somebody that was generally curious about other things other than computers, maybe you took apart the VCR, or maybe do you have like any silly stories of that, like when you were a kid, of like, you being curious, like definitely got you in a little bit of trouble?
I mean, I think I had a good level of curiosity, but I was never that kind of kid that was really a hardware person taking everything apart, at least not to an extent that I would say I was doing that a lot. So the computers, I was really more into the software aspect. When I say took over my life, maybe that has maybe more of a bad connotation. What I mean is that I was really spending tremendous amount of time there. Not only learning to code, I was also playing a lot of games.
Yeah.
On the Apple II, I was just finding, probably had hundreds of games in those days. So yeah, I think it was really something that improved my life. Probably did not improve my school grades. But that's kind of
Sure.
a different story. Um, but yeah, I mean, Apple IIe. From that, I went on to I think I had an Atari ST after, which although interestingly, even though I was learning to code in those days, I was really probably spending most of my time gaming rather than programming. So really the next step for me is when I was done with high school in France, I didn't really know what to do in France, and I decided to go to the US for a year in an exchange
Okay.
program. And I ended up, so it was kind of an interesting story in itself because, most of the kids in France, you want to go to the US, you're thinking of like maybe three places. There's California, there's Florida, there's New York, there's the places you've heard of. I ended up in Wyoming. So
Okay.
that was interesting experience, small town.
Yeah.
But despite it being, sort of in the middle of nowhere, they had a computer lab in that high school that was beyond anything I had ever seen in France because, France was quite behind in
Sure.
computers. And this is where I started getting kind of really serious about programming. And because they had classes and I went from basic to learning Pascal and assembly language and the computers were on the local network. I had never seen that before. So that was really what got me into programming in a more serious way than what I was doing back at home.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, so it's funny because whenever I think of, and this is probably not accurate at all, whenever I think of France and I think of computing, like the first like real programming language that I learned was Ada. And yeah, so I don't know if this is still true, but at the time, like one of the big use cases for Ada was, I believe, the train system or some like major system around infrastructure in France was like written in Ada. And like that, I remember my professor would always say that, and in my head I'm like, but I don't want to like program like train systems. Like, can we learn something like some bit here? But what I realized is that Ada, at least for me, was very accessible. Like, it wasn't a very hard programming language to learn. Comparatively to something like C++ or something, which I think a lot of people, that's like one of their first languages, and it's kind of challenging, right? Because there's so much stuff that you have to worry about.
Right. I did get to do some Ada as well. That was later in college.
Yeah.
As I recall, that language was more associated with the Department of Defense.
Maybe
it was created by them. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's what
At
it
least
was.
that's the.
But I feel like it was like French train systems was like I remember that specifically.
Might have been.
Yeah. Who knows? Who knows, right? But I think, yeah, I think that it is, one of the things that I have constantly seen is like the first programming language you're introduced to, I think it kind of shapes who or what kind of like technologist you are. I think if you're introduced, like, and also obviously like depending on when you get into technology, like if you've been new to tech in the last 10 years, like most people are just JavaScript developers, right? Or some version of JavaScript. Or else if you're a little bit older, like maybe you did Java, maybe you did Ruby, whatever. But it's funny that like I think a lot of people, myself included, kind of have like a soft spot for like the first programming language they ever like learned and like actually like, no, master's not the right word, but like they could actually build a program from start to scratch without it like, needing constant help.
Yeah, I suppose for myself, given the first thing I used was AppleSoft Basic,
Yeah.
I wouldn't really say I have a soft spot
Sure,
for that.
sure.
It was just a place to start, but it was pretty bad. Like it was I don't know if you're familiar with how it worked, but it was, instead of having kind of code that was in a text editor, it was all line numbers.
Yep.
You would have line, and you would have to put the lines like far enough apart that if you want to insert a line in between, you had a number for it. It was, it was fun for those days, but it's not something I would go back to.
Do you think you could?
It's still important to me for
sure.
personal historical reason.
Yeah. Do you think if you were asked to like write a simple program today in BASIC, do you think you could?
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I mean, obviously, I'll have to review the
sure,
syntax,
sure,
but it's
sure.
not that difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, the most basic program you would write like a 10 line 10 print hello and then 20 go to 10.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you would loop the hellos.
Yeah, I remember because one of the classes I took in college was like an assembler class, and
Yes.
I remember like I remember vividly like just feeling like so much empathy for the people that like that's how they had to write software. Like, I couldn't imagine. And you see it like, I think there's like the iconic picture of one of the programmers for one of the Apollo missions. Like, and she printed out, and all the code is printed on a piece of paper, and it's taller than she is, right? Like,
Yeah, I've seen that picture.
yeah, I could not imagine like not having access to something as simple as like generics or asynchronous programming or some of these things that like we just take completely for granted. And
Yeah,
like,
you view generics as something simple. I mean, generics is something pretty complex
yeah,
in the,
exactly.
compared to other languages. Yeah,
But when you think about it,
yeah, yeah.
right? Like, I think is, and I love like the different levels of abstraction, or the levels of that we can things we can care about in tech. Like, yeah, like, yes, generic asynchronous program, like very complicated things. But if you are a C# developer, and like generics is pretty easy to like wrap your head around
Yeah.
implementing it, right? Actually, like writing it, like building the actual framework for it is a bit different, right?
Mhm. By the way, when we started C Sharp, we didn't have generics. That came
Yes.
a few versions later. I forget if it was 2.0 or whatever, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I remember.
Yeah, but I hear you. At the
Yeah.
same time, I'm sure that when you did assembly language in school, like you would not see yourself writing large programs in that, but the learning from
Yeah.
understanding about, registers and things like that that you would never know about if you're just only using high-level languages.
Yeah.
There's some good
Yeah. No,
learnings.
it's funny, like, because I remember, like, I think I might have told the story, so people that have heard it before, I apologize. Like my first job out of college, like I graduated college in like 2010, so like my first job was like, .NET framework. I think we were building WCF apps or something like that. But there's a guy who started the same day as me, and his job was maintaining COBOL apps. So he graduated.
Ouch.
Yeah, exactly, right. He graduated from college.
Yes.
Like I think he went to a computer science program. Like he did Java or Perl or whatever the language of choice was at his school. And like his job, his first job out of school was like maintaining apps that were like older than his parents. And like it's
Oh, why did he take that job? I
well,
don't know.
I don't think he knew. I think, and it was
Yeah.
during the time like 2010 was very strange. Like graduating college, like jobs weren't readily available. Like the economy in the US was still kind of weird. Um, so like if you got a job offer, like you kind of took it. And I don't think he was 100% aware that his first job was going to be like maintaining mainframe apps. But like it's like,
Right.
and the reason why I bring it up is to your point. It's like, well, did you, think about when you were building assembler stuff, did you really think you might be building those things as a job? Well, it's like, unfortunately, like some of us got stuck doing it, right? Um, but I was very fortunate that I got put into a job where I was actually building like modern apps in WCF, which I think a lot of people, if they hear WCF now, they're like, oh, there's nothing modern about WCF. But even though it's like an amazingly flexible
Back in the
framework,
days.
yeah, back in the
Yes.
days. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
so when did you realize that like technology was like, obviously you became kind of obsessed, like you kind of mentioned, right? When did you realize that there was a career path in it?
Probably when I was in the US for that
Sure.
1 year that I
Yeah.
spent in Wyoming. So I was in the, doing this, essentially redoing the senior year of high school.
Yeah.
And after that, I'm like, well, I have to go into computer science somehow.
Yeah.
So I looked for schools in the US. Some of them were too expensive things. Somehow I ended up in Ontario, Canada.
Mm.
So I went to University of Waterloo there, which is,
Good
very
school.
similar in style to US schools, and
Yeah.
it's a very good school. So that was, that was a big transition. In Wyoming, I was probably like the computer whiz kid in the whole school because people were not that much into it. And I found myself in this huge university with lots of really, really smart kids who knew way more than me.
Yeah.
So that was both humbling, but a great learning experience.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I'm trying to like, because it's funny because like the University of Water, like it's like I've heard it being a very, very good technology school specifically. And, I'm curious to know, like, when you were going there, obviously, like, there's a lot of things going on for you specifically, right? Like, you're not from Canada, you're from Europe, you're, you want to get into computer science, you want to get into computing, but you probably don't know exactly like what areas interest you. Like, what was it like trying to navigate all of that? One in a different country, trying to learn like technology, and also like you're in your late teens, early 20s, right? Like, what was all of that like?
Right. Um, yeah, so I think you raised like a lot of good points. Definitely, I was in a new country, a new climate. It was pretty cold, and the culture there, I didn't know. Some kind of funny anecdotes. Like the
Yeah.
first week I was there, people were talking about hockey, and knew nothing about hockey. And then
Oh
the
yeah.
name Wayne Gretzky came up, and I had no idea who that was.
Oh
And
wow.
it was this weird thing where they would not believe that I didn't know who that was, and I thought they were pulling my leg and
Yeah.
inventing some name just to pull my. So. But in terms of computers, that actually went relatively smoothly. I had the right foundation, and it kind of each year built on the previous year. So uh, that felt fairly natural, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
going through one class after the other, and I started getting into also the world of ACM programming contests we
Yep.
had in those days. That was a
Yeah.
fun world. Uh, so, I mean, overall, I would say I had a pretty good 4 years in Waterloo.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, modulo the climate, which I was not crazy about,
Sure,
but
sure. Canada is a lovely country, I think, but there's a few months out of the year, similar to like the Midwest in the United States, where it's
yeah,
just like it's a beautiful area, but there's this like I think the people that live there during certain times of the year, they're kind of being held hostage by the weather, which I think is I lived in the Midwest for 4 years. I lived in Wisconsin for 2 years. I lived in Chicago for 2 years, and I loved it except for when it started to get cold, and I started to kind of regret all my decisions in life that put me to
right,
that
right,
point.
right.
Yeah. Um,
Yes.
here's a fun question. Do you remember like, the first programming assignment in college that really clicked for you, where you're like, oh, like I'm not bad at this. Like this is something that I enjoy doing. It's like yeah, like I'm curious,
Yeah.
like because I think I
Yes.
have one in my head of like the first thing that I was like asked to do that I was like, oh, I was excited to start working on it. Like, do you have a memory of anything like that?
I mean, if I do, I would say it would have been more in high school when I took the computer
Yeah.
classes, in Wyoming that year. I realized I was pretty good at it compared to other kids there.
Mm-hmm.
And then, that carried into college. I think first year of college, what were we doing? I think we were using Macs, and we had that. I forget the environment we were using, but right away I felt very comfortable with that. I couldn't name a specific assignment to your question, but
Yeah.
generally, like I think the click had already happened by that time. So it was more of a evolution
Yeah.
building on that from assignment and class to class.
Yeah.
Yeah, the,
I
the the most interesting assignment we had, the hardest, was actually in my fourth year, where we had this real-time programming course where we had to. They had this huge train track in the room, like a physical train
okay.
track that we had to program in really low-level, real-time things. That was both extremely hard and fascinating. So that's probably the most memorable course.
I mean, that's kind of like early IoT, right? Like that's pretty cool. Like I think it'd be very very hard because I think there's also a lot of pressure to like if I mess up, like bad things can happen, right?
Exactly.
Uh,
That's the point.
yeah.
You don't get to like have a long wait somewhere.
Yeah.
Like it has the actual trains that are going.
Yeah.
Luckily, with no people in it. But
Yeah, I had a like it wasn't a matter of it being super difficult or like super stressful, but I just like one programming assignment that stands out to me is like we had to write like basically like an ATM in C,
oh,
and
uh-huh.
I very much did not understand why we were doing the assignment at the time. I was very much I remember asking the professor like are they do like are there jobs out there to be like C programmers for ATMs? And his response is being kind of an older, I've seen a lot of stuff in tech computer science professor at a university was very much just like, no, but you need to learn what it's like to kind of have some pain. And I think that's what resonated with me a lot because even to this day, I think about like all of the pain that developers put up with in order to get to that successful state, right? Like even when
Right.
I talk to new people in tech, I'm like, you have to be very patient because our whole job is centered around like fixing errors. Like, not very often do we get to sit down and we open up our editor of choice and we just start writing immediately. We're usually coming into a solution or a project and there's something wrong or you need to add something to it. So, like, there's this patience that needs to happen. Um, and I think it's quite fascinating that we put up with so much pain for like that little bit of joy. Like, the compiler says that we're successful, we see our app running, and it powers us to like the next time it happens, right? Which can take a variable
Right,
amount of
right,
time.
right. Yeah. I mean, an ATM, it sounds like a very simple thing, but in terms of the need for it to be truly transactional and
Yes.
foolproof, there's definitely some very big challenges there because the effect if you screw up can be rather
Yeah,
bad.
yeah,
So
and I remember somebody saying like, "What's the worst that can happen?" Like when the professor was talking about the program, he's like, "Well, I think he even gave us a scenario of like this happened in the real world like a few times where somebody there was like a rounding error in one of the programs and it basically just emptied the ATM." Like, and I was and
jackpot.
yeah, and in my head I'm like, that's when I realized like the small things, the small mistakes that we make in tech sometimes can have huge effects, right? And it's always kind of that stayed with me a little bit. The idea of like no bug is so small that it's trivial, because cascading effects do happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
CrowdStrike.
Well, yeah.
I
So
mean, that is mind-boggling.
yeah. So for folks that are listening to this in the future, like we're right after a very large, probably the largest IT incident that I can recall, probably ever, where there were some issues with updating software and that taking down machines, and it really showed like what companies are good at handling like issues that come up in their infrastructure, and then shows companies that are not very good at it. I think what's very very funny is that there are a couple of like big companies right now that are in the midst of like trying to like get some form of compensation, and the response to it is like, well, your competitors like resolve the issue pretty quickly. So what is wrong with your implementation, which I think is pretty fascinating, because it's not just the tech, it's how you implement the tech like at the customer level as well.
Right. I did just read today about I think United and CrowdStrike kind of like going at each other.
Yeah, I think
Whose fault it was.
it was yeah, like I think Delta.
Or is it Delta?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Delta's like suing Microsoft and CrowdStrike for like $500 million or something like that. And somebody was very much just like, why did United and American had the same issue? Like, why are they more or less
Right.
resolved? And it took you like a week and a half, like a week longer, right? Which I think we've all like seen, like if we've all had like a job where you see kind of how the tech has been implemented and you're like, oh, this is not going to go well at some point. But moving on to more like happier topics, like you're in college, right?
Yes.
And eventually you got to get a job. Like, what was it like
Right.
the looking for a job, trying to find out like what sort of job in tech you wanted to get, right? What was it like?
Yeah, that was actually a pretty stressful time for me because, first of all, you always have like imposter syndrome, like
Sure.
I may be good at school, but is there really a company that wants me to do anything real?
Yeah.
In the end, I found myself in sort of a not so great situation where mostly I had applied to Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had applied to one Canadian company that it was not really interested in. And it was sort of a, choice where either I got the job at Microsoft
Yeah.
or I didn't, in which case I had to go back to France and go into the army for 10 months, which is the thing that every boy had to do. We don't have that anymore, but
Sure.
back in those days. So I was like, I really want that job because I didn't want the alternative. Very stressful time, but I did get the job. So things went well. And that's how I ended up at Microsoft. So
Was it
that was the beginning of sort of a new life.
Yeah. Was this at the time, like, I'm guessing you like was Microsoft doing like campus recruiting? Is that how you came about? Like,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
So they came, yeah, they initially came to Waterloo for just an initial interview. It was just one interview. And then if you did well enough, they would fly you back to Redmond,
mhm.
which I did for a full day of interview, which, I did well in some interviews, less well
Sure,
in other
sure.
interviews. I'm like,
Also
I
just
don't know, am I gonna
absolutely,
get this job?
yeah. I also imagine like absolutely like jarring and stressful. It was like your first
It
introduction to
was.
like the professional world. And I mean, I don't know what Microsoft interviews were like back then, but there's always been like this very um, interesting conversation about tech interviews in general and how we've kind of transitioned in
Yeah.
different through different worlds, right? There was a point in time when I think tech interviews were probably just very archaic, right? And
I mean, it was, frankly, it was not all that different from the kind of interviews that I, gave myself at Microsoft and,
yeah,
and saw for the next following, 15, 20, whatever years. It was sort of a question and coding on the board.
yeah,
Or sometimes it was more of a kind of a logic puzzle,
hmm
things like that, which, we can argue whether it's a good system or a bad
yeah.
system, but it's only what it was. And yeah, it was quite stressful.
Yeah, I'm always curious, especially now in this world where every bit of information is readily accessible, and also you have like built-in tools inside of your editor to help you, right? Like, how valuable is it, like the coding exercise? Um, I
Yes.
think it's more how do you solve problems is what companies are really trying to get to the bottom of. Um, like what your thought process is like around solving problems, like how you engage with when things don't go the exact way that you want. And I still think a lot of companies they're very, I don't want to say they get in the way of themselves to find the right candidates because they're hyper focused on like, oh, we need to have this person that can do this algorithm and this person do that. When I think we all know like nobody likes to do whiteboarding. like like writing code on the
Right.
whiteboard is absolutely insane to me. Like I remember I got a job interview one time and they asked me to write in the board and I vividly and I remember this. I said why, and they said well because we want to see that you can do. I'm like, but why would I'm never going to write like during my day. I'm never going to write like compiling perfect code on a whiteboard ever in my job. And I think
But that's really the expectation, though. Usually,
yeah,
like people don't get picky on syntactic errors. They want to see that you can
sure,
have the
yeah,
right logic. So,
yeah.
not saying it's a perfect system, but unless you have an interviewer who is really uh, very inflexible, they would
Yeah.
hopefully not pick on details.
Yeah, I think I just was in a bad mood too because I was very much just like
Yeah.
I don't want to do this, and they're like, okay, moving on, and I ended up getting the job. So whatever, like whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe they thought that I had moxie. I don't know. So you start working at Microsoft, and then you work there for a good amount of time, right? Like, I love to get your
25 years.
yeah, right. Like, I'd love to get your thoughts. Obviously, 25 years is a huge amount of time to work anywhere, right? And you probably saw the company, firsthand go through all sorts of interesting changes. Like, what is the one thing that you would say? And you don't have to make it about Microsoft. You can talk about like the
Right.
tech industry. What is the one thing that you recognized about the tech industry when you got started in tech that is more or less the same now?
That is more or less the same. They haven't changed. I mean, I would say in terms of developer, like basic developer skills, I think are still very similar, although that is something that may be changing very quickly when
Mm-hmm.
we see like what you just mentioned. We have GitHub Copilot and other things. So it could be that the job of a programmer in 5 years is doesn't exist as we know it today. It's possible, but at least for like all the time I was at Microsoft, I would say someone who would have been a qualified developer to join Microsoft back in '93, which is when I joined, like I think could have joined with the same skill set 20 years later. I mean, obviously they would have to catch up on things, but the basic way of thinking around algorithm is didn't change very much.
Interesting. Yeah, no, but obviously the tools have changed a bit, right?
Oh, the tools have
Yeah,
changed.
yeah.
Yes, yes.
Um,
But yeah,
I think we're getting to
go
this
ahead.
point too, and I'd love to get your thoughts as somebody who's kind of lived through this cycle, right? Like, we went from this time frame where okay, like like a lot of computing was done like not on your machine. And then it became this thing where it's like okay, like you need like very beefy, like high performance desktops to be able to do everything. And now we're kind of swaying back to this world where it's like, okay, well, everything should be like remote and you can have like, you can be running your app on you can be building your apps on a Chromebook or a very, very low performance like ARM processor, right? What is your thoughts about how technology is very cyclical, especially as it pertains to like
Yeah.
the requirements of a developer and like what sort of tools that we use to be successful?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you're right, it's been very cyclical. I remember back in, I don't know if it was 2000 something, they had started with, I think it was Sun that was really pushing hard those netbooks. I forget what they were called. This very, very weak devices where everything was being done in the cloud.
Yep.
And then that really didn't go anywhere. And we went back to,
Yeah.
thick clients. And now definitely you can get a lot done in the cloud. Um, I mean, I think more and more, like it has become truly viable to have a machine that has a strong connection and
Yeah.
the machine itself not having to do too much. We definitely, I think it took a lot of back and forth because the technology was not ready.
Yeah.
But now we are very much at a point where it's viable. That being said, still today, if you want to do development in the Microsoft stack, you still need a computer that's good enough to run full Visual Studio and all
Yeah.
that, and so.
Yeah. No, it's quite fascinating to me, like because like I remember like one of the things that was very prevalent when I first started working was like thin clients, right? And this is more like on the
Exactly,
like the
yeah.
end user side where it's like, oh, I want to open up a browser or I want to open up Word or whatever, right? Like I just have a little box on my desk that basically connects to like a website, and inside the website it basically renders that app, right? And I find it
Right.
fascinating now that especially like if I'm thinking about like VS Code remoting, for instance, right? Like this idea is like, oh, you just have like VS Code, whether it's on your computer or it's in the browser or whatever, or it's embedded in some other service, right? Like, and then all of the work isn't actually done where you're typing. All you're really like engaging with is basically pixels rendered on a screen. And yeah, I think one of the things you mentioned, quite frankly, is pretty interesting. It's like we're heavily dependent on internet connection now. And
Yes.
I always think about like what happens if you live in a place or the country that you live in or what have you, like just doesn't have like robust connection to the internet, or at least robust like fast connection to the internet. In the US, in most of the US, you
Yeah.
don't have this problem, but obviously in other parts of the world you do. Like, do you think we're doing ourselves a disservice in tech by trying to offload as much as possible onto like the internet connection versus the hardware of the machine you're actually doing the work on?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we're still in a place where you can do a lot of
Yeah.
disconnected development. When I see, like lately, I've been kind of getting back into the Microsoft stack, playing with .NET Aspire and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
and you can fully test everything locally. You're running Docker locally, so that's kind of acting a little bit like a cloud services,
Yep.
except they're all running there. So to me, it's important to hopefully be able to keep a model where you can work in either mode. So if we're to go to a place where really you cannot do anything without connectivity, I think it's not progress. I mean,
Yeah.
it's unless we really are in a place where connection is guaranteed for everybody everywhere, but it's
Yeah.
it's still not exactly where we are.
Yeah. It's because you see it a lot with like, a lot of, if you talk to a lot of large companies, like one of their biggest, I guess, expenses in the year is like hardware, right? Whether it's developer
Yep.
hardware or server hardware or what have you, right? And like, instead of like, okay, well, instead of paying to own these physical devices, you pay for some service where maybe you had like the cloud replacing on-prem servers or some cloud-based developer environment to replace like your beefy thick client, right? And it's just a matter of like moving money around, but like the value prop is, oh, you don't have to worry about the hardware vendors anymore, but now
Of
you
course.
but now you
Yeah. I
worry
mean,
about,
that's the whole pitch of the cloud,
yeah,
right? But
but now you
yeah.
worry about the software vendors, right? Which, I mean,
Yes.
it's an interesting conversation. And I think one of the things that I'd love to hear from you is like, one of the things that for folks that might not know David, and the work that he's done, like there was a lot of things that you were doing like in this world of like managed services for developers, right? Like, you know, you want to talk about some of the things that you worked on that
Sure,
like in
sure.
that space? Because I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess if I had to break my Microsoft career in three parts at a very kind of course level, the first few years I was in Microsoft Office.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really obviously working on a really, really thick client. After that, I moved to what became ASP.NET.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed in teams that were sort of evolution of that or related project for quite some time. So I would say that was phase two. And phase three was working on Azure when I was
Yeah.
in Azure App Service. And so I got to work with a lot of technology doing that, developing things, from scratch. ASP.NET was certainly a very interesting project.
Yeah.
When I was in Office, I guess I kind of ended up in Office because that's where there was a position
Yeah.
or whatever. But to be honest, I never really liked it. And moving to the back end was really the thing that made me a lot happier. So ASP.NET was a perfect project for me. To go into a bit more details on various projects that I worked on after ASP.NET, there were lots of things like a NuGet. You're familiar with
Yep.
that, right?
Yep.
So that's the basically the package manager. We got to work on that from scratch. So that was probably one of the projects that I'm most happy about based on the impact it has had on
Sure.
the developer community for .NET. And let's see, yeah, when I moved to Azure App Service, one of the cool projects we did was supporting Git-based
Yeah.
deployment. The idea of having you just have your repo and you push some changes and it goes live on Azure App Service, which is now, a pretty common thing. But in those times, it was still, we're certainly not the first one to do it, but it was a somewhat new model
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
some developers. That was a project we called Kudu in
Yeah.
those days.
Yeah. No, I remember vividly like these things kind of coming out, and as a developer who was working for customers and also like doing consultancy, like these things coming out and just being like, okay, like I understand why these things exist.
Right.
To kind of roll back a bit, like I'm curious, you know, you mentioned Office and like the thick client stuff. So you hadn't, so this is before Office kind of became more of like a hybrid like web-based tool and like
Oh,
yes,
definitely.
right.
Way before that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like I would
I
say,
mean, I can give you an anecdote about what I
sh-
worked on early on in Office.
sure, sure.
It blow your mind in a kind of a negative way.
Okay,
I
okay. I'm
was
ready.
My first team was the Office setup team, the
Yeah.
setup program for Office,
Okay.
which sounds like, oh, you're just copying file, but it's actually an incredibly complex problem. And the first thing that I worked on was what we call a disk layout tool, which was basically in those days, Office was still shipped on floppy disks.
Yeah.
Or there was the kind of the early days where CDs were
Mm-hmm.
CD-ROMs were starting to exist, but and basically, the tool I wrote was, I think it took the set of disks from like 47 to 45 by, laying them out more
Oh,
efficiently
wow.
across various disks. And I was like, whoa, we're saving so much money
Yeah.
by reducing by like 2 floppy disks, which is like mind-boggling that it was even a concern. Um, yeah. So anyway,
Yeah.
that's an anecdote. And of course, if you've ever had to install such thing, people would have spent like sometimes 2 or 3 hours
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
insert this number 23.
Yeah, no, I didn't have the joy of doing it with floppy disks, but I remember vividly, like,
Yes.
you know, installing Visual Studio or installing Office or what have you, and like, you know, having to do the CD exchange dance where like, okay, CD
Right.
comes out and then like you'll get a prompt, put in CD2, CD3, whatever, right?
Exactly.
And
So think of the same
yeah,
except at the next scale because
yeah. And then I remember like when
floppies only held
DVDs
like
when DVDs
646.
came out and DVDs started to be more like, you know, more accessible, like,
Right.
oh, it's one because like I remember vividly
Yep.
like
Yep.
4.7 gigabytes for a DVD, like 800 megabytes for a CD, like this is great. This is like the savior of all
Exactly.
things, right? And then eventually you're like, oh, just download like this 200 KB file and then just run the installer and it'll get everything from the internet. Which
Exactly.
which
Yes.
which is pretty crazy because that's like in not a very long time frame going from
I know.
47 floppies to download something that's like fits on one floppy, and then it just downloads everything from the internet. Like it's not a very long
Right.
time, like in the grand scheme of things, which is pretty crazy to think about.
Yeah, let's call it 20 some years,
Yeah,
maybe. Yeah.
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 So you go from like that work in Office, and then like .NET, which I think for a lot of folks that have been following .NET for the 20 years that it's been around, it's been through like this very large evolution, right? And when you joined the .NET team, like it was still kind of this is still like in the ASP.NET era, like where you're building
Oh,
web
yeah.
forms and Ajax control toolkit and all these sort of things, like yeah,
Exactly.
and you're
Yeah.
kind of building for a
Yeah.
platform that is still fairly new, right? Like the web, like even
Exactly. That
though,
was a huge
yeah,
challenge.
like
Yeah.
even though like
Because we didn't have like it's not like .NET 1.0 was created and then we built
yeah,
ASP.NET 1.0 on top of
yeah,
it. The whole thing was being done at the same time.
yeah,
And we had initially no tools. In fact, interesting fact, the very first version of ASP.NET, which in those days was called XSP, was the code name, was written in Java. And then at some point we moved on from Java, and there was like some internal language that somebody had written, which we call SMAC, SMC,
mm-hmm,
which then eventually it got replaced by a language that was called Cool, which is basically C
yeah,
sharp.
which became C sharp, yeah,
So like we went through many tool sets that were limited, buggy, like all while trying to develop ASP.NET, on a very essentially unstable, not just the tool set, but the .NET framework itself was non-existent in the beginning. And so it was very interesting challenge.
yeah. No, it's like for people that are kind of in this world, like the origin stories of .NET and ASP.NET are pretty fascinating, right? Like we talk about all of the things that not to be crass, but like just throwing stuff at the wall and like, oh, is this gonna work? Oh, it works. Okay, let's keep on moving forward, right? Um, and I'm curious, like once there was like a stable state where it's like, okay, like this is a pretty standard mission, like I do a talk at conferences about kind of like the history of ASP.NET, and I talk like a lot about key milestones in like the evolution, like, and the one that always sticks out to me is like when MVC came out, right? Because I think
Yes.
that's like the time then, like I guess you can probably think of it as like the more modern .NET starts to show up, right? Like like there's some
Yes.
form of open source to it. It's following kind of like a well established like application development pattern, like all these things. Like I remember like from talking to people that like there was lots of internal trying to figure out like what's the best approach for some of these things. Like as somebody who was doing that work, like I'm curious, like what was the day to day like? Because at the end of the day, like that .NET that came out in that time frame is substantially different now, but a lot of the key principles are still there.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely a big transition because if you look at where ASP.NET started, we had this model which we call web forms,
Yep.
which I would say was at the same time was brilliant and was an abomination.
Sure.
It was doing a lot of magic to try
Yep.
to pretend that something was running almost like client side
Yep.
by round tripping massive amount of view state. And it worked. It was sort of magical
Mm-hmm.
in that sense. But was it a great idea? Like, I don't know. I don't know. But then, like you said, MVC came, was a much more modern way of doing
Yep.
things. And also the open source factor. We haven't talked about open source at all. So maybe that's an interesting
Sure. Yeah.
segue
Yeah.
into open source, which uh, it, that's actually a very drastic evolution in what I experienced at Microsoft. Because back in the days, even both in Office and in the early days of ASP.NET, everything we were working on, we had basically a huge pressure to create patents for them.
Yep.
It's like, oh, you're doing anything new? What can we patent out of there? And every time you had a patent application, you would like win a cube, and later you'd win that wooden plaque, and it
Yeah.
was sort of
Yeah.
the people were so proud of having so many of those things, but we were really patenting things that were, frankly, some of them were nonsense or
Sure.
were like small technicality that
Yep.
still got blown up by lawyers into extremely large things. And then eventually we transitioned to open source, and all of that went away. Like it kind of changed from being like the cube of fame to the cube
Yeah,
of shame. Uh, and interesting anecdote is when I left the US to go to France, I had massive collection of all those things, and I threw it all away. I was like, those things are not adding anything to my existence,
sure, sure.
and
All of
so
your
yeah,
all of your
open source
patents,
has been.
all of your cubes
Go
are
ahead.
are now gone somewhere floating around,
Yes,
which
yes,
is
yes. And the wooden plaques. Luckily, I had a neighbor who was into woodworking, so he thought he could do something out of them. So I said, "Okay, here you go." I had
yeah,
like
sure.
30 of those wooden
Yeah.
things. I don't know what they became. I
Yeah.
don't know if I want to know, but
You mentioned about the open source thing too, right? Like talking about like MVC and kind of like the open sourcing of .NET, and you talked about NuGet, which for folks that might not be aware
yes,
is kind of like the gateway for the community or open source development in .NET, right? Like it's a package manager, right? We've had,
exactly.
I've interviewed on this show Isaac Schiller, who is the founder of NPM, and like it's funny talking to him about some of the challenges that he thought of and how NPM solved the problem. And I'd assume, like for you, as one of the people that was working on NuGet right from the beginning, like when did you realize that like we need something like this? We need like a distributed package manager
Yeah,
for .NET, because otherwise like it's just floating DLLs around everywhere.
yeah. I mean, frankly, it was a fairly blatant problem. Having to go to some random website and download something. It was both difficult, untractable, very dangerous. You could catch a virus very easily.
Yeah.
Uh, to something where you just, you get installed or whatever it is. So it was, and the reaction from the community was overwhelmingly good.
Yeah.
And again, that's the case. We're far from the first one to do that. Other environment that had package manager, it's not like we're competing with
Yeah.
them. In fact, we were inspired by a lot of things that were happening in other environments, and we took some of the ideas in terms of versioning and things like that. But no, overall, I think I'm pretty happy with where I went. And in addition to being helpful to the community, NuGet itself was probably the first project that I worked on that was fully open source.
Yeah.
Um, so it was, in those days, it was on Codeplex using Mercurial,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
still, by and large, it was a true open source project.
Yeah. And it's fun.
And
Sorry, go ahead, finish what you're saying.
you go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and now it's funny because like you go to NuGet.org and you search for a package, and then like the first place that usually I look is like, okay, where's the source for this code live? And it clicks and it goes to like a GitHub repository, which is now like the de facto place
Right.
where you put open source stuff. Um,
Exactly. Exactly.
and like
Yeah.
to continue the trend of like the open source stuff is like then you move on to the stuff on the Azure side, and that is heavily dependent on the use of open source tooling, things like the Onyx runtime, and using web standards
Right.
like Owen and things like that, right? Like when did you realize that this open source thing is essential to like the lifeblood of the technology landscape?
I mean, I think as soon as I started using it,
Yeah.
which for me was for NuGet, which initially you're like, oh, it's weird. I'm going to write code and the world gets to see it right away.
Yeah.
But it clearly became clear that it was the right path. And in fact, we mentioned Kudu, the Git deployment based feature of Azure App Service was itself written as open source.
Yeah.
So sort of every project that I worked on after that, later on, it was Azure Functions, which was also open source. So I think from that point on, I would say 90% of what I worked on at Microsoft was open source.
Yeah.
And because by that time, everyone was accepting it, and there's no looking back.
Yeah.
And in fact, lately, I started getting into this .NET Aspire project, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
And I got to make some contribution. I don't work there anymore.
Yeah.
But I was just, I want to have fun and write some code. And
Yeah, I mean it's pretty fascinating too, like the idea that, like you said, you can find a tool that you're interested in, and if the community or the project is accepting, like you can just directly contribute to it, which I think is just absolutely fascinating. Especially talk to people that have been in technology for a long time, like it used to be Like people used to kind of hoard their software, like hoard the things they built.
Yeah.
Like I can't share this with you because it's intellectual property, or like it's my secret sauce that's going to like get me jobs or whatever. And now we live in this world where like people are kind of rewarded for the amount of open source work that they do, right? Which I think is
Yep.
which is awesome. There's this whole conversation to be had about compensating people for the work they do in open source, but that's for another day. But I'd love to know, as we wrap up, like, you've had a very interesting kind of trajectory starting from, like Tuur said, like building apps that to an extent are very closed source. And, now you're in the world where you're contributing to open source, not working at a company, right? And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts is like, what is like, what does the next iteration of tech look like? We're living in this world right now where, like you talked a little bit about it, like containerization of tools and co-pilots, like language models for AI, and all of it's centered around open source. Like models are open source for large language models. Tooling is open source. A lot of tooling is free. Most programming languages and frameworks are free. What do you think that the landscape looks like over the next few years? Obviously, without a crystal ball, like
Yeah.
I'm
I
curious.
mean, I don't know, but I am sure that AI is going to play a huge part because it's just, it is a revolution. Uh, it's hard to know exactly where it's going,
Yeah,
whether it's going to destroy us all or help us or a combination of both.
sure,
But I feel there is no going back. I mean, I said earlier, like I still enjoy like coding, but I do feel like the way we're writing code today is maybe borderline obsolete in 5 years. So
sure, yeah,
I'm kind of looking forward. I mean, hopefully it's just a skill set that kind of transitions
hmm
to a different thing where you still need. But I don't think we're going to be writing code line by line the way we've
yeah.
been doing ever since.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that the biggest thing to kind of, and this is a great way to kind of to wrap up the conversation, is like it's about problem solving, right? Like
Yes. Oh
all the
yeah.
technology in the world, it really only exists for us to be able to solve problems, right?
Of course.
And
Yeah.
as long as the tools continue to help us solve problems, like we'll need to adapt to use the right tool for the job, right? Um, you know, Going back, we were talking about like building a rail system, right, earlier, right? Like imagine, you know, that the needs change. The needs are still the same. There's still software that exists that needs to like control and manage like rail systems, but more than likely the tools that are used to that are probably a bit more complex than they were 30 years ago when you were working on them or whatever, right? So it's pretty fascinating because the problems kind of stay the same, but the tools change because
Oh yes.
there's new
Yes.
focus on how the tools can make things a bit more robust, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm very excited to see how that changes.
Yeah.
Of course, I have some slight worries that things may go in the wrong direction, but overall, I'm optimistic.
Yeah. No, I think being optimistic is a great approach because we live in this world where like I don't know if people have ever asked you this, but like people ask you like, "Oh, David, what do you want to be doing in 3 years? What do you want to do in 5 years?" And I'm always like, "Well, I don't know what the world is going to be like in 3 or 5 years. Who knows, right?"
Right.
And but I'm always optimistic that technology is always going to be there to solve problems. It's just the the problems are probably going to be a little bit different, but more or less the same, and the tools are going to be different. And as long as I'm curious about how to solve those problems, I'll be fine. And I think that a lot
Yeah.
of people, if
Yeah.
they kind of subscribe to that, are going to be fine as well.
Exactly. It's a mean to a goal,
Yeah,
and yes, the tool changes. The goal mostly stays the same.
yeah.
Yeah.
This conversation has been absolutely great. It's been great to kind of get to know how you got started and some key areas of your life that you found interesting and kind of getting your thoughts on some of the different, trends that we've seen in tech over this, the last 30 years or so. And for folks that aren't following David and the things that he's getting into these days, I highly recommend it. Like you can find him, one of the ways is on Twitter. So that's David Ebbo, DavidEbbo. And there'll be some links to show in the show notes to some other places you can find him as well. So, as we wrap up, I'd love to, give the opportunity if you have any kind of parting words for, all of our friends here before we sign off.
Um, well, I would say keep coding, stay connected to
Yeah.
technology, keep learning. Definitely, that's one thing that sometimes I didn't always do right at Microsoft when I was so deep in the project that it was hard to keep aware of everything. I think it's good to always step back and see, what's in the distance while at the same time having your daily job.
Yeah.
Not the most profound thing, but
No,
that's
I
what
mean,
comes to
no,
mind.
I can't agree more. I think it's very important to just be aware of all the things that are going on because like you said, you snap your fingers and it's 30 years later and you're like, oh, okay, that's cool. And I think that
Yep.
being able to think about the real impact that you bring is really important. And this conversation has been awesome. I really appreciate your time, David. I know that it's getting late for you, and
Oh,
and
thank you, Isaac.
and
Yeah,
we
it's been great. It's been
yeah,
fun.
and we both have to hop off and watch a track race right now. So,
Exactly. 1,500 meter
yeah,
final.
I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for tuning in and the ones listening in the future. So, my name is Isaac Levin for Coffee and Open Source. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, Isaac. Bye bye.